The first sound wasn't a scream, it was the slow, rhythmic clang of doors locking down, one after another, like the heartbeat of Pelican Bay itself. They said you could feel the tension before you ever heard it. The air was heavier there, steel, sweat, and silence pressed into the concrete. Inside California's most notorious supermax, men were buried in concrete boxes barely bigger than a parking space. For 23 hours a day, they lived in silence so absolute it started to sound like a voice of its own. Pelican Bay was designed to break people quietly. No riots. No fires. Just time, stretching, folding, erasing faces. But in 2011, something began to stir behind those steel doors. Something the state never expected: unity. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. They called it a hunger strike, but inside the SHU, the Secure Housing Unit, it was more than that. It was defiance without a weapon. Inmates from rival gangs, Black, White, Latino, and others, laid down their long-standing wars for one cause: to be treated like human beings again. The strike started with a few dozen men. Then word traveled through the vent shafts, the plumbing, the walls. Within days, thousands across California prisons joined them. They refused food, refused to be forgotten. The Department of Corrections called it a disturbance. Guards were ordered to contain it, isolate the ringleaders, and cut communication. But isolation was already their reality. What could they take away next? One of the leaders, Todd Ashker, a man who'd spent over 2 decades in solitary, scribbled legal notes by hand, using dull pencils and paper passed secretly between cells. They weren't just starving, they were documenting every detail, every deprivation. By the 3rd week, bodies weakened. Some collapsed. A few were hospitalized. Yet the strike didn't break, it spread. Families outside began to notice. Advocates, lawyers, even journalists started asking questions. The words Pelican Bay began appearing in headlines for the first time in years. Still, inside those walls, retaliation brewed. Rumors of cell extractions circulated. Guards whispered of cleanups. Inmates braced themselves for the sound of boots in the hall. But then, something unexpected happened. A legal letter, smuggled out through an attorney, landed on a federal judge's desk in San Francisco. It alleged cruel and unusual punishment, systemic, deliberate isolation without cause. For the first time, the silence of Pelican Bay was being recorded as evidence. As the months passed, the prison administration faced mounting pressure. Yet in the SHU, no one knew whether the outside world even cared. The men who started it all were still locked in darkness, waiting for a sign that their suffering meant something. Then, one morning, as breakfast trays slid under the doors, an officer slipped a single envelope to Ashker's cell. No words. Just a small white envelope with a government seal. He tore it open, and what he read changed everything. The letter wasn't long, but it was louder than any voice that had echoed through Pelican Bay. It came from a federal court, acknowledging what the state had denied for decades, that indefinite solitary confinement might, in fact, be unconstitutional. For the men inside the SHU, it was the first crack of light in a place built to keep light out. Todd Ashker pressed the paper flat on his concrete desk, his hands trembling. Around him, the silence of the tier deepened. Men who hadn't spoken in years began calling out, cautiously at first, then louder. A piece of mail had become a message of hope. Outside the walls, lawyers and activists were already moving. The Center for Constitutional Rights had filed a class action lawsuit, Ashker versus Governor of California, naming hundreds of men who'd spent 10, 15, even 30 years in solitary. The complaint wasn't about escape or violence. It was about sanity, about time, about whether a man could be buried alive while still breathing. Inside, retaliation followed fast. Cell searches, confiscations, strip-outs. The administration labeled the movement a security threat group. Officers ripped legal papers to shreds, tossed radios, cut power. But the more they cracked down, the more eyes turned toward Crescent City. the outside world began to see what Pelican Bay really was, not just a prison, but an experiment in control. Concrete cubes stacked in silence. No contact visits, no programs, no voices, just fluorescent light and isolation. Men learned to talk through air vents, to write on soap wrappers, to keep their minds from dissolving. A guard once said, "Pelican Bay doesn't punish the body, it punishes the idea of being human." And that was exactly what the lawsuit aimed to change. Months turned to years as hearings dragged on. Inmates wrote affidavits, describing hallucinations, heart palpitations, the way time folded on itself until they forgot what day it was. Some described hearing footsteps that weren't there. Others couldn't remember their families' faces. But for every testimony, the state fought back, arguing that isolation was necessary to manage the worst of the worst. The courtroom became its own kind of battleground, where words replaced weapons. Then came 2015. After 4 years of legal warfare, California finally blinked. The Department of Corrections agreed to settle. Thousands of men, once labeled as gang associates, would be reviewed and, for the first time in decades, many would walk out of the SHU. When the news broke, Pelican Bay didn't celebrate with cheers. It was quieter than ever, a stunned, heavy kind of silence. Some men cried without sound. Others stared at the walls that had defined their lives, realizing they might actually leave them behind. Ashker sat on his bunk that night, the letter of victory now creased and worn. Freedom wasn't guaranteed, but something bigger had been won: acknowledgement. The system that thrived on silence had finally been forced to listen. Still, inside those walls, not everyone was ready to let go. Some guards felt betrayed. Some inmates didn't trust the promise. And in the corners of Pelican Bay, whispers began again, not of unity, but of fear. Because when the doors finally open, not everyone knows what to do with the light. When the first cell door at Pelican Bay's SHU slid open, it sounded less like freedom and more like disbelief. The metal screech echoed down the corridor, bouncing off the walls that had memorized every whisper of the men inside. For the first time in decades, movement returned to a place built to erase it. One by one, inmates stepped out, blinking, hesitant, almost fragile. Some hadn't felt sunlight without a steel cage above them in over 20 years. Their eyes watered as if light itself was too bright to be real. Todd Ashker watched from behind glass. His turn would come later, but in that moment, he understood something profound. This wasn't just about release, it was about resurrection. The human spirit had managed to outlast a machine designed to break it. Outside, reporters framed it as a legal victory, a historic settlement ending indefinite solitary confinement in California. But inside, victory felt different. It was quiet. It was uncertain. Many of the men leaving the SHU were walking into prisons that felt just as cold, just as dangerous, only with more noise and less routine. Some of them couldn't sleep with the sound of voices nearby. Others flinched when doors slammed. Years of silence had rewired their minds. What the court had called a win for justice still carried the invisible scars of what came before. Ashker himself remained in custody, but he was no longer buried in a box. He was studying law, writing letters, helping others navigate the system that once swallowed him whole. "They called us the worst of the worst," he wrote in one letter to an advocate. But the worst thing was being forgotten. Even among guards, the mood had changed. Many had believed the SHU was essential, that control was safety. But as the years passed, even they began to see the toll, the suicides, the hollow stares, the way men turned into shadows of themselves. Some officers quietly admitted they'd been part of something too big, too brutal, to justify. The 2015 settlement didn't erase Pelican Bay's history, it exposed it. California's prisons began to re-examine what security really meant and what it cost. Across the state, thousands of men were transferred out of solitary, forced to relearn how to exist around other human beings. And yet, for all the progress, one truth remained: no one leaves Pelican Bay the same. The walls may not speak, but they remember every name, every echo, every deal struck in the dark. Years later, Ashker's legal papers would become part of national prison reform debates. His defiance, born in a 6 by 10 foot cell, became proof that even buried voices can change the law. Standing in the yard one afternoon, under an open sky he hadn't seen in 24 years, he said something to the man beside him. Simple. Quiet. But powerful. "They tried to make us disappear," he said. "Instead, we made them see." If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.